All right. Our next speaker is Yoshua Bengio, again, someone who I don't think I really need to introduce, but since I'm here and I'm supposed to, I guess I will do it. He got his PhD in computer science from McGill. He's professor of computer science and operations research at the University of Montreal and a Canada Research Chair on Statistical Learning Algorithms. He's the author of over 200 publications with over 75,000 citations, co-creator and general chair of the International Conference on Learning and Representations. He's been inspired by and trained again by the likes of Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, and Michael Jordan. He's been central to the development and the explosion of work on and the success of deep learning. His paper with Jan LeCun on deep learning has been cited over 9,000 times. He's known for his contributions such as curricular learning and general adversarial networks. He's been instrumental in bringing connectionism from principles and parlor tricks to practice, from toy models of semantics and family relations to cars that are starting to drive themselves. But I think what is most impressive, at least to me, is that he's done all of this while remaining within the folds of academia, and I don't think I have to sort of elaborate on that point. I really greatly admire him for that. I think he stands as a model for the kinds of scientists I'd like to see of the future, as I believe that academia is still and will continue to be the best place for real deep learning. So with that, I will introduce Yoshua.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the organizers to have brought me here and witnessed something that we don't see very often, a meeting of the minds from these different communities. So I'm really, really glad that this is happening. For those who are interested in learning more about deep learning, with my co-authors, I wrote a book called Deep Learning that came out last December, and that's meant to help people with some undergrad math and computer science get into the field or understand it or use it, and apparently it's selling a lot. I want to thank a number of people, but we have a little bug here. So I'm going to tell you later about some work that I've been doing with several collaborators in the last couple of years, trying to bring Backprop closer to the brain. So in particular, Benjamin Cellier, Walter Sen, João Sacramento, Asia Fisher, Thomas Ménard, Dongyun Lee, Olexa Bilyaniuk, and Jonathan Binas, who's here. And of course, I want to thank Jeff Hinton, who's been really an inspiration for much of that work and a lot of other work I've done. So, before I start, let me say something important regarding the kind of work I want to do and how I think it relates to the goals of this conference. So we're trying to understand the brain, all of us here, I think. And there are many ways in which we can relate to this question of understanding. And the way that I like is, when I understand something, I can explain it to someone else in a compact way, right? So that's what I mean by understanding. That's the kind of understanding that we have in physics with fairly simple physical laws. And of course, if you consider physics, the full description of how things are happening in the world is incredibly more complex than the physical laws that underpin it. And the thing that I'm interested in is really discovering these kinds of compact descriptions that help us understand human and machine and animal intelligence. So in machine learning, we can bring something to this exploration. Basically, we're looking at such principles and testing them by running experiments with machines, not with people or animals, trying to see if those principles embedded into algorithms and specific software implementations can solve difficult tasks, can learn complex tasks. The thing that I'm going to tell you a little bit about later is also important if we want to see if those principles relate to how humans become intelligent. We need to validate those kinds of ideas with neuroscience and biology, and I think, you know, it'd be nice if we had more of that, of course. Okay. Let me spend a little time to talk about neural nets and what brought me to this field around 1985, which was connectionism, because a lot of what I'm doing and a lot of what's the success of today's deep learning owes to the ideas that came out in those days. So I've tried actually to do a one-sentence description of the main lessons that I drew from connectionism from the 80s. So it's about iteratively learning distributed representations through a composition of neurally inspired simple operations, so these are what the neurons, the abstract neurons are supposed to be doing, towards a justifiable training objective. This is something that I really think is quite important, that the whole system is optimized with respect to something, such that the learner is forced to capture the relevant statistical structure of the data. So that's connecting to maybe higher level goals about understanding the world and probability as an important tool to do that. Now, let me say a few words about one of the things that really makes neural nets work, and that is distributed representations and depth, so multiple levels. There is now a number of papers, several from my group, which produce mathematical and empirical evidence that these two aspects can provide an exponential advantage in terms of ability to generalize or ability to represent functions compactly compared to machine learning approaches or even, you know, other kinds of approaches that don't exploit these kinds of assumptions. Because basically one thing that is important to understand about machine learning is that you can't get generalization if you don't make any assumptions about your data. And humans are learning machines, and so they are making assumptions about the world, and these assumptions somehow are embedded in, you know, in our genetic material and the construction of our brain even before we're born. So a lot of what we're trying to do in machine learning is come up with a way to formalize those assumptions. Maybe it's in the form of architectures, maybe it's in the form of the training framework. It can come in different forms. It doesn't have to be always very explicit, but at the end of the day, this is, you know, what distinguishes a successful algorithm from another, and of course also the computational aspects that we just heard about of limited resources is something that comes into the matter. Now, in particular, here I want to mention something interesting, which is that if you think about these deep neural nets and the kinds of things you're computing, if you cut through the middle and you look at some hidden layer and you think about what each neuron is computing as a feature, what you get with that representation is a description of the input space, which is very, very rich. That's the key with distributed representations, that they can represent an exponentially large space of configurations of the inputs. But what makes it possible to generalize very well is that you can learn from about this exponentially large space of possible configurations with a number of parameters and thus a number of training examples, which doesn't scale exponentially but scales linearly with the number of these features. And that's one thing that distinguishes neural nets, and especially the deep ones, from, say, non-parametric, more classical non-parametric methods. One example of this actually that has been seen practically, I mean, in experiments is from the work of Toralba's group, where they've tried to characterize what a deep convolutional net trained on recognizing places had learned in its hidden units. And you find units that specialize on, you know, have discovered the notion of people or lighting or tables, at least as far as their visual appearance is concerned. Even though these concepts were never shown or in terms as labels by the system. So somehow these features actually correspond to meaningful concepts, at least at some level. So one question I get asked a lot is, so what's new with neural nets with deep learning and this century? And of course, one important aspect is we have tricks now to train these networks, even though they're deeper than what we were able to do in the 90s. And it turns out that one of the tricks, and very few people know about this, actually came from work we did inspired by biology. So my student Xavier Glorot wanted to explore a nonlinearity for neural nets, which was closer to biology. And of course, these kinds of rectifying nonlinearity had been used for a long time by biologists, but it turned out that when you stick them in these deep multi-layer networks, it just makes training much easier, and they have now become a standard that really, there are some variations now, but it's really important. Another example of inspiration that came probably from biology, I assume, because it came from Jeff Hinton, is this injection of a noise inside the network, what we call dropout, which has some similarity to spiking and helps to regularize and make these networks more robust. Another thing which has seen a lot of progress in this century compared to the previous one is unsupervised learning. Jan LeCun talked a lot about this, and he introduced GANs, the generative adversarial networks, on which there's a lot of work recently. So I'm not going to go through this, but if you have the idea that neural nets are just pattern classification machines, things have changed, and they can generate these kinds of images, so they can creatively produce a diversity of images, sounds, texts, and so on. That's quite impressive, although I would say, as Jan was saying, we're far from having nailed that particular problem. Another thing I want to mention that's connected to unsupervised learning, and I put these slides because I feel like in the talks that I heard here, this notion wasn't necessarily compatible with what I heard. The notion of disentangling factors of variation, something I've been discussing a lot in the last decade. When we're trying to learn representations, so what is our neural net learning in its hidden layers, or what it should be learning, and what kind of representations our brain learning, there's the question of what makes a good representation. And of course, for many decades, we've known that good representations, useful representations, would be ones that somehow would be invariant to the things we don't care about, and only sensitive to the things we care about. But the problem is, if you consider like a learning agent, like a human or an animal, or a robot that's going to have a very long life, it's hard to know ahead of time, what the future will bring us. And so, if you're not sure what the future task will be, then you should, as a safeguard, instead of throwing away a lot of information that currently you don't need, you should try to be a little bit more conservative and just separate the different aspects of the world, some of which may be relevant now and others might be relevant later. So this is the idea that we don't want to necessarily compress information and eliminate what we consider now to be noise, but rather to separate the different aspects that explain what we're seeing, the causal factors ideally. And if you're able to do that, then you can really considerably reduce or even eliminate what's called the curse of dimensionality that makes statistics difficult in high dimensions. And it really makes it easy for a learner, once it has discovered those factors, to learn a new task and to essentially just select the factors that are important, and even do things that seem crazy, like learning from zero examples, but I won't go and explain that. Another thing that's changed is that's related to the idea that neural nets are not anymore just processing vectors to do classification, is the introduction of attention mechanisms in neural nets. This is really, really something that's changing how we do machine learning these days. So attention is in principle very simple. It's about gating some computation and maybe selecting some computation to focus on aspects of the data or of the elements in our representations. And we introduced this in the context of trying to crack the problem of machine translation using neural nets a few years ago. And we introduced a particular form of attention, which we call content-based soft attention, which has turned out to work really, really well, in which the translation neural net will generate one word at a time in the output language. Say it's going to produce one word in English, one after the other. But as it does that sequentially, it's allowed to look in the input sentence or its representation, its semantic representation, which has been extracted by some other recurrent net, and to focus its attention on one or a few words. And this ability to just, eliminate from the processing most of the input sort of just makes it much easier to do some tasks. And it was night and day when we introduced this thing into the systems. And, in a few months, we went from really bad systems to state-of-the-art systems. And a year and a half later, Google put that in their Google Translate. And of course, there's a lot of other complex engineering tricks and other nice things that have been added. But now, if you look at how machine translation was a couple of years ago with n-grams compared to sort of how human translate according to human evaluations, the current neural nets have more than halved sort of the distance between the old systems and human translation. So this is something pretty important. And of course, it's allowing neural nets now to process not just images and fixed size vectors, but any data structure. Anything that can be represented by some graph, by some list, by some tree, any kind of data structure set. We can use these things as input. We can produce these things as output using attention mechanisms. And this kind of technique has also been used, and I think this is also a very important change from what we've seen in the past, to augment these neural nets with a memory. So in other words, you can think of it like we have a piece of network which is like Cortex-like, which you can think maybe as a controller and something that represents information, and combine that with something, say maybe hippocampus-like, that's going to allow you to do one-shot storage and represent memory that can be stored quickly and then we can use attention to decide what to write where and what to read where. I mean, where to read. And again, we can learn, where to put attention given the context. So depending on the state of the system, those networks can learn to attend to what's most relevant to the current state of the system. And once you see this, you can also see how this can be used to reason, at least in the neural net sense. So we're not talking about reasoning in the classical AI, logical, modus ponens sense. We're just saying what we mean by reasoning here is that the network will sequentially combine pieces of information, and through learning, it figures out, what's the right way of combining these pieces of information. So depending on the tasks, it will learn to do modus ponens, or it will learn to do other kinds of reasoning that we know exist and humans do, for example. And this has been used for question answering tasks as an example. All right. So to put what I'm talking about in the perspective that Josh Tenenbaum introduced at the beginning of this conference, neural nets are somewhere in between brain implementations and cognition. There's a lot that could be said about how they can move up or move down depending on the kind of investigations we're looking at. Some of the things I've talked about, how attention can help us deal with data structures, to learn to access memory, to reason. I haven't talked much about language and semantics, but it's also highly related. At the end of this presentation, I'll say a few words about a current project which involves representation and the notions of objects and causality, which I think relate a lot to cognition. But for the most part, I'm going to tell you about some work that I've been doing that's moving down closer to biology, about how Backprop could be potentially implemented by brains. So, so Backprop. Blake Richards said it all, so I don't need to repeat these things. He gave a really great introduction to this subject and has amazing new ideas that I just die to read the paper for understanding better. So some of the key points to get from that is the thing that really works in the applications of deep learning is this idea of end-to-end training, where we have a big complicated system with many modules, with attention, with memory, with different pieces that talk to each other, but they're all trained together with respect to this one common objective. Sometimes there's a game theoretical thing like in GANs where you have different modules have different objectives, but even in that case, we can have an interpretation that it sort of makes sense mathematically to do that. So, and even in that case, we have Backprop being used to do credit assignment, so to propagate information about how things should change in various places in the system. Problem is, oh, and by the way, and Backprop is not just used for supervised learning, it's used for reinforcement learning, it's used for unsupervised learning, generative models, so it's everywhere right now in deep learning. Problem is, how could it possibly be implemented by brains? In some of the questions, like, how would the equivalent of the backpropagation equations be implemented? And one thing that I'll mention is there's one issue, which is if you look at those equations, they're actually linear propagation. So, of course, there's nonlinearity involved, but in terms of the errors at the next layer are a linear function of the error at the layer downstream. And it's not clear how neurons could do that, that kind of linear computation, and whether there should be like a separate network doing this, and as Blake was saying, how is it going to synchronize its weights to match the main network? So there's all kinds of questions that are open. So here I just list a few papers and current work in that line of thought that I'm involved in. And I'm not going to go through all of these things, but I'm going to sample some of the ideas in several of these papers. So this is just for reference. So one of the first papers we did was trying to connect SGDP to something a little bit more amenable to the kinds of things we do with neural nets. So it turns out that if you have weight changes that are proportional to a presynaptic times a postsynaptic term, where so the rho here is a firing rate and S is the voltage potential or the equivalent. And so if we take the rate of change on the postsynaptic side times the firing rate on the presynaptic side, we get weight updates that end up looking like the SGDP, the signature of SGDP, if of course you put in spikes on top of these rates. So that was one starting point, which sort of stimulated the next piece of work, which was about I think one of the key ideas here, which is that if you have a network that has both feedforward and feedback connections, and here I'm going to assume that the feedforward and the feedback connections are symmetric, so it's a recurrent net, and you let it settle to a fixed point, and later I'll tell you that we can get rid of that assumption. So if you clamp the input, it's going to produce some outputs, and now there's something interesting that happens if you nudge the outputs a little bit in the direction corresponding to a better answer. In other words, you now know the right answer, and instead of clamping it on the outputs, you're just pushing a little bit the outputs towards the right answer. So this creates a perturbation to the fixed point, and then if you study how that perturbation propagates down the layers, it looks like Backprop. There's some scaling issues, but it has essentially the same properties as Backprop. So this was a kind of starting point. And when we did this paper, we considered that these fixed point computation, we could think of inference. In fact, if instead of just running the deterministic dynamics, we consider adding noise to this, then this approximates a particular form of Monte Carlo Markov chain. And the important thing to have in mind here also in the later work is the way we conceive the dynamics, at least it's a convenient way to think about that it corresponds to minimizing some energy function. And so here, the state of the system is just evolving by gradient descent on the energy plus some noise. So you can study both deterministic systems, and then we're interested in those fixed points corresponding to where the energy derivative with respect to the state is 0. So S dot here is the temporal derivative. So fixed point means ds dt equals 0, but we also want that to correspond to a minimum of some energy function. And you can generalize these kinds of notions to stochastic units. And some of the theorems we've worked out have the stochastic version, where now you don't actually get to a minimum, but you get to a stationary distribution, which just corresponds to the Boltzmann distribution of this energy function, which just means that if you wait long enough, then the state distribution is as a probability proportional to e to the minus energy, which is just a stochastic version of the deterministic thing. Okay, so one way to think about this nudging idea that got us some mileage, and the latest paper we published on this, which we call equilibrium propagation, is that we're going to change the energy function. So instead of clamping like we do in Boltzmann machines or contrastive Hebbian learning, instead of clamping the outputs and having these two modes or two phases, we are still going to have these two phases, but in the phase where we get to see the answer, we're just going to change the energy function so that we're going to pay a small price, beta times the cost of our prediction compared to whatever the target was. So that's the beta here is a small scalar, a small positive scalar in the nudging phase, but it would be 0 in the prediction phase. So you could imagine we have some network with recurrence, and then the outside world imposes some constraints or nudging when the information is revealed. So we came up with this theorem, mostly the work of Benjamin Cellier, that ends up telling us how we should change the weights. So don't worry about the notation. I'm going to explain this, but essentially, we end up with an equation that tells us what's the true gradient of the cost function, the thing that we're trying to minimize, which maybe is like prediction error, but it could be any objective function for which we know how to compute derivatives with respect to the output. And we end up with an equation that says, well, we should consider small perturbations, small beta, small nudging. And so in the limit of these small nudging, we're going to just compare the derivative of the energy with respect to the parameters, which are what we call sufficient statistics, so the same kind of thing we see in Boltzmann machines. In both situations, one corresponding to the fixed point achieved when the network is allowed to relax and produce its answer, and one when we also impose a little bit of nudging towards the right answer. So we have these two forms, and we take the difference between those two, and that gives us the gradient. And there is a stochastic version of this. All right, so that's interesting, but there are still many things that are not biologically plausible in this formulation. First of all, how does that relate to things like SGDP? Well, if you choose a particular energy function which looks a lot like the Hubfield energy function, then you end up with weight updates which are essentially the same as what I had before, except they are symmetrized. So if you had a way to make the feedforward and the feedback weights agree with each other, then you would get these kinds of updates. And you're able to train neural nets, these kinds of neural nets with feedback connections using this rule. The one most bothering problem with this particular approach is that we have to really wait to get close to the fixed point, so it might take like hundreds of time steps of simulations here before we are allowing the network to do an update of the weights. Otherwise, the gradient is not correct and it doesn't learn well. And also that this depends on how many layers you have, and somehow for deeper networks it gets it takes more and more time to enough precision in converging to the fixed point. So these are sort of nagging problems that we're trying to fix now, and I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Another issue, so related to this issue of it takes a lot of time to converge to a fixed point, we investigated a particular kind of energy function, which I call the feedforward energy function. And it's not really a new kind of energy function or something that people have studied in different guises. So it's just an energy function that says that what we really want to have at the end of the day is the result of a feedforward computation, right? So if you minimize this, well, the minimum is when the state at level k is weighted sum of the firing rates corresponding to level k minus 1. So that's just the usual feedforward computation. In other words, if we had an implementation that was just doing feedforward computation, in one pass it would achieve the fixed point, at least in the prediction phase. Now there's some issues with this, so that's really nice because we get convergence, immediate convergence, and also that allows us to connect with traditional neural nets. And so maybe you're going to ask me, well, so what happened with the feedback connections? Well, they're still there, but they're sort of implicit in the energy function. So in the previous energy functions I showed you, we had Wij and Wji. We had feedforward weights and feedback weights, and they had to be symmetric and so on. Now, what we have is that if you take the derivative of the energy function, you have two kinds of terms, and they correspond to the feedforward computation and the feedback computation. And the feedforward part of the energy function, we can just recognize when we set that to 0, we get the normal feedforward equations. And for the second term, you notice that if the first term is 0, in other words, if we have set the activity according to the feedforward computation, the second term vanishes. So in the feedforward situation, the feedback will somehow magically cancel if we were to follow that derivative. But of course, the question is, how would a biological implementation do those computations? The feedforward thing is the usual neural computation. It's not clear how to do the other one there. So that's one thing I'm going to be telling you about. Yes. Yeah, as I said, that energy function leads to one-pass convergence at prediction time. And if there is no nudging, then the second term, the feedback term, cancels. And then there's something even more magical that happens, which is that in the gradient formula from equilibrium propagation, we have these two terms, one which is in the prediction phase and one which is in the nudging phase. And it turns out that with these kinds of energy functions in the prediction phase with beta equals 0, the first term cancels, becomes 0. And so the only thing that remains is the in the sufficient statistic that we need for our update is the second term, which comes in the nudging phase, which essentially, if we're gonna see, corresponds to implementing Backprop. So so what this is saying is maybe we don't need to have two phases. Maybe we can be having a system that's continuously making predictions and getting feedback at the same time, and we don't need to have this alternation between predict, get the answer, update, predict, get the answer, update, which is a traditional view that we have with Backprop and that we had in the first formulation. Right, so let's look at this a little bit in a bit more detail. If we are near the fixed point solution, so beta is small, and we look at the equations for the derivative of the energy that tells us in which direction the neurons are moving. So what we're seeing is that we have a term that's pushing each neuron to satisfy the bottom-up input. So it's just saying, you know, the previous layer is telling this guy what to do with the usual feedforward kind of computation. And what this guy is doing is saying, aha, well, you should change the layer K so that if the guy at the next layer has a discrepancy between its state and what you're sending it, then you'd like to help it reduce that discrepancy by moving in this direction, all right? And then if you're an output unit, you also get to be nudged towards whatever the outside world wants you to do. Okay, so if we set this equal to 0, at a point where beta is small, then we see that these errors, the discrepancy between the state and the bottom-up input into the neuron, these errors actually correspond to backpropagated errors. So if you look at this formula and you remember something from Backprop, it's exactly the formula for Backprop. In other words, there is a way to find the solution to the nudged phase, which involves a single downward pass, which only propagates these perturbations, and it would compute exactly the same thing as Backprop. Okay. Now, there's a problem here, which is that in this phase where we're just propagating those perturbations from layer K+1 to layer K, we're doing this computation, which is multiplying this error that we have, this perturbation that we have, this discrepancy between the bottom up and top down, really, at the next layer, and then multiplying by the nonlinearity of the neuron and multiplying by the transpose of the feed-forward weights. And so there are several issues here. One is, how do we get the transpose of the feed-forward weights? And the other is, this whole thing is linear in the perturbations at the next level. So how are we going to implement this kind of equation, which is linear computation? So one idea that we are working on and seems to give interesting results is to use lateral connections to set up a system that will allow to implement this kind of equations, because yeah, we know how to implement that part of the updates, but it's not clear, you know, what's the neural implementation of this thing. So how do we do that? So the idea that we're exploring is that these errors, which correspond to the backpropagated errors, they're going to correspond to the difference between bottom-up and top-down inputs in pyramidal cells. And so the bottom-up we know is just a weighted sum of inputs from the previous layer. So what about the top-down? Well, top-down is actually going to be the combination of two things. It's going to be the combination of actual feedback from the next layer and lateral connections from the same layer through interneurons. So I'm going to show you a picture here that's better. So you have these pyramidal cells. They have bottom-up input, and that's coming into the basal dendrites. And they have these apical dendrites that Blake told you about. And then we're going to have two kinds of inputs into the those dendrites, the direct feedback from the next layer and through what I call mirror interneurons, maybe Martinorti cells, feedback from other units and the same unit, but you know, I mean other units on the same layer to the same place. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be thinking of training those lateral connections so that they are canceling the feedback coming from above. So the network is trying to figure out what the feedback from the next layer is going to be and learning to cancel it. Why would we want to do that? Because the only thing that this layer can predict about the layer above is sort of the normal behavior that doesn't depend on the outside injection of errors. So it's going to try to predict the behavior of the downstream units in the situation where beta equals 0, where there is no error, there is no external signal that comes in. And so when we combine the signal from above with the lateral connections, if there was no nudging, then this would be 0 and there would be no contribution to the learning here. But if there is an error higher up, then it's going to show up here and potentially produce a signal that can drive the learning here. So that's what we've been experimenting with. And we can train MNIST on the 2-layer network using this kind of thing. But now let me make other connections. So there is an interesting connection between this and some of the ideas that Jeff Hinton proposed in 2007 that Blake already referred to, that relate those errors that are being propagated to temporal derivatives of the activity of the neurons. So it turns out that if we start from the condition where there is no nudging, and we consider how these errors are going to change over time, well, they will be proportional to those propagated gradients that we'd like to see. So the error information is really encoded in the temporal derivative of the activity of the neurons. And the other thing, of course, is if we were to follow the Backprop rule, what kind of update do we want? Well, we want something that's very similar to what I showed you before, except we instead of the temporal derivative of the postsynaptic, we have this error, but that error is the temporal derivative, right? So this whole thing is the same thing as we had before. So again, this is something that would be naturally implemented by SGDP. Okay, let me say a few words about the weight symmetry, which I sort of mentioned as an issue. So again, Blake told about this already, and he told you about feedback alignment, experiments suggesting that, well, maybe you don't need to have exact symmetry. In fact, you can fix the weights. I have some doubts about whether this completely solves the problem. I think you still want those weights to be approximately close to the transpose or functionally close to that computation. But there is something I think that can save the day here and will have later uses, which is a set of both experimental results with simulations with denoising autoencoders and a set of theoretical results from the group of Aurora, which both suggest that if you consider 2 consecutive layers and you think about the feedforward computation and the feedback computation as together forming an autoencoder, and that autoencoder in our case has also noise injected in it, then if you try to optimize the weights so that you minimize reconstruction error, you will often end up with those 2 set of weights converging to the transpose of each other. All right. So I think this is something that needs more both theoretical and experimental work, but there is evidence on both sides. So for example, the theory requires sparsity, which is something reasonable for brains, and potentially other assumptions that need to be verified experimentally. But there's this paper we put out 7 years ago, which shows something like this happening with autoencoders. So I think there's some hope on this issue of symmetry of the weights. And finally, there's another thing I told you about, which was that, well, we don't really want, when we have these dynamical systems, we don't really want to wait for a fixed point before we do an update. We'd really like to have a system that can make updates all the time. And so we have a new formulation, and this is work with Walter Sen, and the experiments that are being done by Jonathan Benas, who's here, in which instead of thinking of the state of the system as the activity of the neurons, we think of the state of the system as jointly the activity and their temporal derivative, so the velocity, something more similar to what we find in physics, then actually finding the solution of dE, this extended state equals 0 becomes very easy. And if you just write this equation, you end up with a relationship between the state and its derivative, which defines the dynamics. In other words, you can give me any dynamics, which is whatever your network does, and I can come up with an energy function that is such that so long as the network computes those dynamics, you now are always on this particular manifold of the state and its derivative that satisfy this equation. And so we can actually apply the equilibrium propagation equations that tell us how to update the weights all the time. We don't have to wait for convergence. And we tried this, and it works, and it's very stable, and it seems to be robust to the depth. So we need to do more experiments with that. But the figure shows that, well, the errors goes down in some of the experiments we're running pretty quickly, and also that you can change the inputs and the nudging targets on the fly, and you can update all the time. And the size of the updates might not be the same all the time. These are the size of the updates, but learning works. Okay, so there's a lot more work to be done. We want you to test those kinds of theories on real brains, I'm not an expert enough in biology and neuroscience to tell you what the right experiments should be, but there's some pretty obvious things that should be true. For example, testing the idea that we are doing something like gradient descent could be observed by checking whether after the updates of the weights at the next trial, some key neurons that was important in the behavior should improve in the sense that it's now doing something that makes the output closer to the right answer. And if we're able to identify such neurons, then we should be able to see that not only after the next trial you're getting a sort of more appropriate activity for this neuron, but in addition, in the few, say, 100 millisecond or something on that order of magnitude, after there's been a surprise and learning, due to nudging, this neuron's activity should also improve. In other words, this is due to the weights changing, and this is due to the activity changing. So the nudging has as an effect that all the neurons should be moving towards quote-unquote better configuration that would give rise to lower error. And this potentially could be something we would observe if we can make these measurements. This theory about having feedback and natural connections canceling each other, again, is something that can probably be tested. For example, if there is no nudging, there is no surprise, then somehow the contribution from the apical dendrite should be 0. And if you're able to stimulate those interneurons either to increase their activity or decrease it, then you should be able to see increased or decreased LTP corresponding to that. And I'm sure many more experiments can be devised. All right, so to conclude that part, Backprop has been really the workhorse of the amazing successes of deep learning, and it would be great to see if brains can have a functionally equivalent implementation of something that does credit assignment according to similar principles. And it would help us understand how brains can learn more complex tasks, maybe different from the typical tasks that people in psychology and neuroscience are testing, but more like the tasks that machine learning people are testing. I don't have a lot of time, so let me just move to the last little topic, my last slide, to talk about something now going in the direction of cognition. So I've talked mostly about neural nets making contact with brain sciences. So there's also a lot of work in our field trying to make neural nets do more sort of high-level cognition types of computation. And in my group, the way that we are thinking about this is representations, because as someone said, representation learning is the heart of what deep learning is about. This is how we called our conference, ICLR, International Conference on Learning Representations. And I don't think that right now we have really satisfying ways of forcing a deep network to learn representations that are more abstract, in other words, that will generalize better, and furthermore, that capture causality. In other words, how things in the world are really related to each other. And so let me tell you a little bit about a paper that we put out on arXiv recently that attempts to go in that direction. So the objective is to use agent learning, so some kind of reinforcement learning in an environment, to help discover better representations that capture something about causality that has to do with maybe affordances, like how agents can influence the world, and how to use that influence to name things in the world in the sense of setting up appropriate representations. And so to explain that idea, let me use a prop. Okay, so here's an object here, the control mouse or whatever, the pointer. I just made up a policy to control it. I can move it in space. And I can do it independently of other factors that explain the world around me, right? I could choose to, instead of move my phone and not move the mouse. So what's happening here, why am I telling you this? Because it would be very convenient if my brain had not only the ability to produce this policy that controls this particular factor that explains things around me, but also to represent that. And I think that we get an important clue about good representations, that some of the factors that hopefully our brain represents fairly explicitly correspond to aspects of the world that we can control independently. In other words, that we can change, I can change the position of this bottle and not move other things. This is very important because if I'm going to be able to control the world later and I know, these building blocks, these factors that allow me to control separate aspects of the world, it becomes much easier to come up with policies that combine those building blocks, those options as they're sometimes called, in order to come up with complex policies. Also, those factors are likely to correspond to good explanations about the world. Positions of objects in images, of course, is something important, but instead of hardwiring that notion, as we normally do with supervised learning, what I'm talking about is an objective function, of which we've tried a few, that is saying, let's train a system that jointly learns policies, a family of policies, and neurons, sort of feature detectors at some level in the network, such that for each feature corresponds a policy, and the policy has the property that it changes that feature and tries to change as little as possible the other features. Right? So it seems to be like a chicken and egg thing because one depends on the other, but that's not unusual in neural nets, right? Like each layer depends on the others, and we can deal with that. And GANs is even worse. And so that's interesting because it maybe helps to separate out different aspects of the world, so disentangle them, and it also connects to higher level notions that people care about in cognitive science, like objects and attributes and agents. So once we start talking about attributes, talking about agents is not very far. I'm sorry, about objects is not very far. I mean, an object is just a collection of attributes that somehow have something to do with each other. For example, when I move this thing, I'm controlling a bunch of attributes together, and somehow, if I can control it, maybe I can more easily change some of the attributes. So there's a tight connection between those attributes in the sense that the way I can control them is tightly linked. And then the notion of agent comes because in my initial explanation I said, well, those factors correspond to aspects of the world that I can control independently, that I can control. So I'm an agent, right? I'm an entity that can control things in the world. But I could also have factors in my mind that concerns aspect of the world that I can't control, but that you can control. And I'd like to model that, right? So now I have to think about other agents and what they could do. And even if I don't have access to some of those factors directly, by imagining those agents doing things and executing policies, I can build a better model of the world, which of course children use all the time to control us, right? All right, so I think this opens up a bunch of other interesting high-level questions and connects also to natural language, because I believe that natural language gives other clues about these high-level causal factors. Why is it that we use those words? Why is it that we use those concepts in natural language? They are the things that typically we can manipulate, that we can act upon. And so if we want to train machines to understand the world, I'm sure that it'll be easier if we talk to them. That's basically what I'm going to close on. Thank you.